Imagine walking into a gleaming corporate office building in downtown Chicago, the kind with marble floors so polished you can see your reflection. That's where Maria Rodriguez spent her evenings for the past 15 years, quietly moving from office to office with her cleaning cart while executives rushed past without a second glance. But what these suits in their corner offices didn't know was that Maria wasn't just emptying their trash bins and wiping down their desks. She was paying attention, really paying attention. You see, Maria had always believed that respect wasn't about the job you did, but how you did it. Even as some executives would carelessly knock over their coffee cups right after she'd mopped, or leave conference rooms looking like war zones minutes before important client meetings, she maintained her dignity. With her hair neatly tied back and her uniform pressed to perfection, Maria took pride in her work. She didn't just clean rooms, she transformed them. But everything changed one late Tuesday evening in March. The office was nearly empty, except for the usual workaholics and a group of senior executives huddled in the main conference room. As Maria approached to begin her usual cleaning routine, she heard laughter echoing through the glass walls. She was used to being invisible, but something made her pause this time. Can you believe she thinks she deserves a raise? One voice carried through the door. These cleaning people need to know their place. They're lucky to even have jobs with the way automation is going. Maria's hands tightened around her cart handle, but she kept her composure. What these executives didn't know, what none of them had bothered to learn, was that Maria had put herself through night school while raising 3 kids on her own. She had an MBA from DePaul University, earned one class at a time over 8 long years. But finding opportunities had been hard, and she'd kept her cleaning job to make ends meet. The conversation in the conference room continued, but now it wasn't just about her. They were discussing plans to outsource the entire cleaning staff to cut costs, despite record profits that year. Maria stood there, invisible as always, but this time she was absorbing every word, every figure, every detail of their planned presentation. What happened next would shake this company to its very foundation. You see, Maria wasn't just any cleaning lady. During those 15 years of invisible work, she built relationships with every security guard, every IT specialist, every maintenance worker in the building. She knew their stories, their struggles, and most importantly, their worth. But Maria had one more ace up her sleeve. Something she'd discovered during her late-night cleaning sessions that would turn this entire corporate power structure upside down. While tidying up the CFO's office one night, she'd noticed some concerning numbers that didn't add up. Being invisible had its advantages. People would leave sensitive documents right out in the open, have loud phone conversations about questionable dealings, and type passwords in plain view. The next morning, instead of going home after her shift, Maria walked into the building wearing a different kind of uniform, a crisp black blazer and pencil skirt. She had an appointment with someone these executives never imagined she'd reach. Eleanor Thompson, the chairwoman of the board, who happened to be in town for quarterly reviews. "Miss Rodriguez," Eleanor had said, looking up from the folder of documents Maria had prepared. "Are you telling me you've been working as a cleaning staff member here for 15 years while holding an MBA? "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And there's something else you need to see." What Maria showed Eleanor that morning would set off a chain of events that would reshape the entire company. But here's the thing. This isn't just a story about corporate takedowns or whistleblowing. It's about something much more fundamental. Human dignity, respect, and the mistake of judging people by their uniform rather than their character. By the time Maria walked out of that breakfast meeting, the wheels were already in motion. But she wasn't after revenge. She wanted justice. Not just for herself, but for every invisible worker who kept this company running while being treated as disposable. The CEO's face when he was called into an emergency board meeting that afternoon was just the beginning. He walked in with his usual confident stride, probably expecting another routine discussion about quarterly projections. Instead, he found himself face to face with Maria, now sitting at the board table next to Eleanor Thompson. But what happened in that boardroom? Why did the CEO leave the building that day carrying a cardboard box? And most importantly, how did Maria transform from the invisible cleaning lady to the person who would reshape this company's entire corporate culture? Well, that's where our story really gets interesting. Because sometimes the most powerful people in the room aren't the ones wearing the expensive suits or sitting in corner offices. Sometimes they're the ones quietly observing, learning, and waiting for the right moment to step into their power. What unfolded over the next few weeks would not only change Maria's life, but would send shockwaves through corporate America. It would spark conversations about workplace dignity, corporate responsibility, and the true meaning of leadership. But before we dive into those extraordinary events, let's back up and look at the series of small moments that led to this massive shakeup. Stay tuned for what happens next, because this story isn't just about one woman's triumph. It's about a movement that would inspire thousands to stand up for their worth, their dignity, and their right to be seen as more than just their job title. Let's go back to where it all began. 3 months before that fateful board meeting, Maria was doing her usual evening rounds when she overheard a conversation that would change everything. The CFO, James Mitchell, was having what he thought was a private phone call in his corner office. Maria was emptying the recycling bins, moving quietly as she always did, when she heard him mention creative accounting and offshore accounts. Now, Maria wasn't just any observer. Remember those night classes at DePaul? Her specialization was in corporate finance and ethics. As she continued her cleaning routine, her trained ear picked up phrases that made her blood run cold. They weren't just cutting corners. They were deliberately hiding profits to justify layoffs and deny worker benefits. Every night after that, Maria began paying extra attention to the documents left carelessly on desks and in printers. She noticed patterns: inflated expense reports, hidden profit margins, and suspicious transfers to shell companies. But she didn't act immediately. Instead, she did what she'd always done best. She watched, listened, and gathered information. During her 15 years at Griffin and Mitchell International, Maria had become something of a mother figure to the night shift workers. There was Tony, the security guard putting his daughter through college; Sarah, the IT specialist who worked nights so she could care for her elderly mother during the day; and George, the maintenance supervisor who'd been with the company for 20 years but still earned barely above minimum wage. These were the people who kept the company running smoothly, yet they were the ones most at risk from the executives' cost-cutting schemes. Maria would often share her homemade tamales with them during break time, and over steaming cups of coffee, they'd share their stories, their dreams, and their struggles. "You know what gets me?" Tommy had said one night, his coffee growing cold as he spoke. "My daughter's studying business at the same university where you got your MBA, Maria. But when I tell these executives that, they look at me like I'm speaking another language, like we're not supposed to have ambitions beyond these uniforms." Maria understood that feeling all too well. She remembered the day she'd finally earned her MBA, how proud her children had been at her graduation. She'd applied for multiple positions within the company, positions she was more than qualified for, but was always passed over. The rejection letters were always polite but clear. They were looking for candidates with different experiences. What they really meant was they couldn't see past her cleaning uniform. But Maria had used her position to her advantage. While the executives saw her as invisible, she had built a network of allies throughout the building. The IT department had a special respect for her. She was the only one who remembered their birthdays and brought them homemade chocolate chip cookies. Sarah, in particular, had become a close friend. "Maria," Sarah had whispered one evening, glancing around the empty office, "I've been monitoring some strange network activity after hours. Large data transfers to unknown servers. Something's not right here." That's when Maria started connecting the dots. The suspicious phone calls, the hidden documents, the network activity. It all pointed to something much bigger than simple cost-cutting measures. But she needed proof, concrete evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. Then came the night of that executive meeting, where they laughed about denying raises and planning mass layoffs. What they didn't realize was that Maria had already compiled a detailed dossier of their activities. Every late-night conversation she'd overheard, every document she'd photographed with her phone, every suspicious transaction she'd noted, it was all meticulously organized and backed up. But Maria wasn't just after justice for herself. She thought about Tony's daughter, about Sarah's elderly mother, about George's grandchildren. She thought about every worker who'd ever been made to feel small, invisible, or disposable. This was about something much bigger than personal vindication. That's why she reached out to Eleanor Thompson, the board chairwoman. Eleanor had a reputation for being tough but fair, and more importantly, she had a history of championing ethical business practices. What many didn't know was that Eleanor had started her own career in the mailroom of a different corporation 30 years ago. She knew what it was like to be underestimated. The morning of their meeting, Maria arrived an hour early, her hands shaking slightly as she organized her evidence. She'd changed out of her cleaning uniform into a business suit she'd bought years ago for job interviews. Interviews that had never led anywhere. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't asking for permission to be in the room. Eleanor listened intently as Maria laid out her findings, the offshore accounts, the falsified reports, the systematic exploitation of workers. But what really caught Eleanor's attention wasn't just the evidence of financial misconduct, it was Maria herself. "You've worked here for 15 years, Eleanor said, studying Maria carefully. "Why come forward now?" Maria's response would later be quoted in business schools across the country, because sometimes being loyal to a company means being brave enough to save it from itself. But as Maria left that meeting, she had no idea of the firestorm she was about to ignite. The CEO's dismissal would just be the beginning. The real question was, how would the corporate world react when they discovered their next leadership lesson would come from someone they'd never even bothered to see? As the emergency board meeting was called, tensions were running high throughout the building. Word was spreading fast that something big was happening, but no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The cleaning lady in the boardroom was just the beginning of a story that would reshape not just one company, but an entire industry's understanding of worker dignity and corporate responsibility. But before we reveal what happened in that boardroom, let's talk about the moment that would test Maria's resolve like never before. The tension in the boardroom that day was thick enough to cut with a knife. CEO Richard Preston sat at the head of the table, his usual smirk fading as Eleanor Thompson began laying out the evidence. But it wasn't just any corporate investigation. This was different. With each slide of Maria's presentation, the color drained further from Preston's face. "These cleaning staff you plan to lay off," Eleanor said, her voice steady but sharp. "They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're people with families, with dreams, with dignity. And one of them just exposed what you've been hiding from this board for years." That's when Maria stepped forward, no longer in her cleaning uniform, but wearing confidence like armor. The same executives who had laughed at her just days ago now sat in stunned silence as she methodically broke down their financial schemes, complete with dates, documents, and damning audio recordings. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While Maria was presenting, her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. It was a text from Sarah in it. "They're deleting files. Massive server purge happening right now." The corporate machine was trying to cover its tracks, but they didn't know that Maria and Sarah had already backed up everything. Meanwhile, down in the lobby, something remarkable was happening. Word had spread through the building's underground network, the same invisible web of maintenance workers, security guards, and cleaning staff that had helped Maria gather her evidence. They began gathering in small groups, not to protest or cause trouble, but to stand in quiet solidarity. Tony, the security guard, had positioned himself near the executive elevator, watching as nervous-looking managers rushed up and down, carrying boxes and shredders. Georgie, the maintenance supervisor, noticed several high-level executives trying to access the server room, a place they'd never shown interest in before. Back in the boardroom, Richard Preston tried one last power play. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, straightening his Italian silk tie. "Are we really going to let a cleaning lady destroy everything we built? Do you know what this will do to our stock price?" That's when Eleanor Thompson delivered the line that would later make headlines. "Mr. Preston, I'm more concerned about what you've already done to our company's soul." But just as the board seemed ready to act, Preston played his final card. "If I go down," he threatened, "I'm taking everyone with me. You think Maria's the only one with evidence? I've got 15 years of dirt on every person in this room." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't just about financial misconduct anymore. It was about a deep-rooted culture of corruption that had infected every level of the company. Maria felt her heart racing. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when doing the right thing might not be enough. She thought about her children at home, about her colleagues downstairs, about every person who had trusted her with their stories. Had she just put them all at risk? But then something unexpected happened. Patricia Chen, the usually quiet board member who had worked her way up from an entry-level position 30 years ago, stood up. "I was once invisible too," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Not anymore. I have my own evidence, Mr. Preston. Shall we compare notes? One by one, others began speaking up. It turned out Maria wasn't the only one who had been watching, waiting, and documenting. The company's hidden workforce, the security teams, the IT department, the maintenance crews, that had all seen things over the years. They had all kept their own records. Down in the lobby, the crowd had grown larger. Employees from every department were gathering, drawn by the energy of something historic happening. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were participants in a moment of transformation. But just as the tide seemed to be turning, Maria's phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Someone had leaked details of the meeting to the press. Outside, reporters were gathering. The stock price was already dropping. Preston's face curved into a subtle smile. Chaos was his element, and he thrived in it. Eleanor Thompson called for a brief recess, but as board members filed out of the room, Maria noticed several of them huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. She caught fragments of their conversation. Damage control, public relations nightmare, need to protect the shareholders. Maria realized that exposing the truth was just the beginning. The real battle would be ensuring that justice wasn't buried under corporate politics and PR strategies. As she watched Preston whispering to his allies on the board, she understood that the next few hours would determine not just her fate, but the future of every invisible worker who had dared to hope for change. The question now wasn't just about firing a corrupt CEO. It was about whether a company built on privilege and power could truly transform itself. And as Maria prepared to re-enter that boardroom, she knew that the hardest part of her journey was still to come. Stay tuned for what happens next, because the biggest surprises in this story aren't just about what was hidden in those financial records. They're about who else steps forward when the truth finally starts to come out. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the boardroom windows as everyone filed back in for what would become the most dramatic hour in Griffin and Mitchell International's history. Maria could feel her heart pounding as she took her seat, but her hands were steady. The past 15 years had taught her patience, and now that patience would face its ultimate test. Richard Preston had used the recess wisely. As board members returned to their seats, Maria noticed something had changed in their expressions. Some wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. Others kept checking their phones nervously. She'd seen that look before, the look of people who'd been made promises or perhaps threats. Before we continue, Preston announced, his confidence seemingly restored, "I think we should discuss the real damage being done to this company right now." He gestured to a screen showing the company's plummeting stock price. "Ms. Rodriguez's accusations have already cost our shareholders millions. Is this the kind of corporate responsibility we're advocating for?" But Maria had anticipated this move. She slowly pulled out a folder she'd kept hidden until now. Sarah from it had helped her compile something the night before. Something that would change everything. As she reached for it, Preston's eyes narrowed. Just then, the boardroom door burst open. Linda Martinez, the head of human resources, rushed in clutching her tablet. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice shaking, "but you all need to see this." The room fell silent as Linda connected her tablet to the main screen. Email after email began to appear, hundreds of them, pouring in from employees at every level of the company. But these weren't just complaints or accusations. These were stories of small acts of corruption witnessed over years. Stories of being silenced, overlooked, and pushed aside. Stories that echoed Maria's own experience. "They're not just coming from our building," Linda explained. "They're coming from every branch, every office, every facility we operate. It's like a dam breaking." Preston's face hardened. "This is orchestrated harassment," he snapped. "A coordinated attack on our company's reputation. I demand that we—" But his words were cut short by a commotion outside. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, they could see people gathering in the office space beyond. Employees were leaving their desks, stepping away from their cubicles. Some held papers in their hands. Others were filming with their phones. "What are they doing?" Someone whispered. Maria knew exactly what they were doing. This was the moment Sarah had helped her plan, the moment when every invisible worker would become visible, but even she hadn't expected what happened next. The elevator doors opened, and out stepped George, the maintenance supervisor. Behind him came Tony, the security guard, and Sarah from it. They weren't alone. With them were representatives from every department, every floor, every part of the company that Preston and his allies had overlooked. Eleanor Thompson stood up, her eyes moving from the gathering crowd to the emails still popping up on screen, then finally to Maria. "I think," she said carefully, "we need to hear what they have to say." Preston slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. You can't just let them in here. This is a board meeting, not a town hall." But Patricia Chen was already walking to the door. As she opened it, the sound of hundreds of conversations flooded in. These weren't angry protesters. These were employees standing together, holding evidence of their own. Years of documented abuse, of corner cutting, of safety violations swept under the rug. Maria watched as Preston's face went from red to pale. She could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about the offshore accounts anymore. This wasn't even about him. This was about a system that had been built on silence, and that silence was finally breaking. But just as the momentum seemed unstoppable, Preston played his final hand. He pulled out his phone and made a single call, putting it on speaker for all to hear. "Execute Protocol 0, he said calmly. Suddenly, every computer screen in the building went black. The lights flickered. Somewhere, an alarm started blaring. "What have you done?" Eleanor demanded. Preston's smile was cold as winter. "Insurance," he replied. "Every server, every backup, every piece of digital evidence. It's all being wiped as we speak. Good luck proving anything without it." The room erupted in chaos. Board members jumped to their feet. Someone shouted for security. Through the glass walls, they could see panic spreading through the gathered crowd as people rushed to their computers. But Maria didn't move. Instead, she opened that folder she'd been holding, drew out the single USB drive, and placed it on the table. Sarah had taught her well. Sometimes the oldest tricks were the best ones. "Mr. Preston," Maria said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through butter, "I think there's something you need to understand about being invisible. When people don't see you, they don't guard their secrets. When they think you're nobody, they forget to watch what they're doing. And when they believe you're powerless." She never finished that sentence, because at that exact moment, something happened that would change everything. The boardroom door opened one final time, and the person who walked in made Preston's face turn whiter than paper. But before we reveal who that person was and what happened next, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered what really makes someone powerful? Is it their position? Their money? Their connections? Or is it something else entirely? Because in the next few minutes, everything you think you know about power is about to change. The figure who walked through that boardroom door wasn't just anyone. It was Amanda Preston, Richard Preston's own daughter, and the company's lead counsel in Europe. She carried a thick binder in her hands and wore an expression that mixed determination with disappointment. "Dad," she said quietly, "it's over." Richard Preston's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, betrayal, anger, and finally, fear. "Amanda, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in London." "I've been here for weeks," she replied, placing the binder on the table, "ever since Maria reached out to me with her initial findings. Did you really think she went straight to the board without making sure she had everything covered first?" The room fell silent as Amanda opened the binder. Inside were documents that made the offshore accounts look like pocket change, evidence of systemic corruption that went back decades. But more than that, there were photos. Hundreds of them. Pictures of Preston and his executives at private meetings with known criminal enterprises, handshake deals in backrooms, envelopes changing hands in parking garages. "Your cleaning lady," Amanda continued, nodding respectfully toward Maria, "didn't just clean offices. She cleaned up evidence. But unlike you, she kept copies." Preston lunged for his phone, but Sarah from it stepped forward with a small smile. "The Protocol 0 you just activated, it was redirected. Instead of wiping the servers, it just backed up everything to secure locations. We've been ready for this move for weeks." The gathered employees outside the boardroom windows had gone quiet, watching the scene unfold. Tony, the security guard, stood at the door, arms crossed, making sure no one could leave. George, the maintenance supervisor, held up his phone, live streaming everything to thousands of employees across all company branches. Eleanor Thompson stood up, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Preston, I think it's time for that cardboard box we mentioned earlier." But Preston wasn't finished. He straightened his tie and laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. You really think this changes anything? I built this company. I own this company. The shareholders will never. The shareholders have already voted, Patricia Chen interrupted, sliding a document across the table. Emergency meeting by proxy. While you were trying to wipe servers, we were counting votes. Effective immediately, you're not just fired, you're out. That's when Maria finally opened the folder she'd been holding all along. Inside wasn't just evidence of financial crimes, it was proof of something far more powerful. Hundreds of statements from employees at every level, documenting not just what was wrong with the company, but how to fix it. Detailed plans for ethical reforms, worker protections, and corporate responsibility initiatives. The invisible workforce hadn't just gathered evidence, they created a blueprint for transformation. You see, Mr. Preston, Maria said, standing up. While you were busy looking down on us, we were busy looking forward. Your daughter didn't just help us expose the past, she helped us secure the future. The next few moments happened in a blur. Security arrived, not Preston's private security, but federal agents who had been waiting downstairs. As they led Preston away, he kept looking back at his daughter, perhaps finally realizing that his greatest mistake wasn't his crimes. It was teaching his own child to value power over principle. But the real surprise came next. Eleanor Thompson picked up Maria's folder, studied it for a moment, and then made an announcement that would make headlines across the globe. The board has reviewed the transition plan submitted by our employees, she declared. And we've come to a unanimous decision. The new CEO of Griffin and Mitchell International will be chosen by a committee representing all levels of our workforce. And a first nominee. She turned to Maria, but Maria was already shaking her head. With respect, Maria said, I don't want to be CEO. What I want is to create something new, a position that ensures no one in this company ever feels invisible again. And that's exactly what she did. Today, Griffin and Mitchell International has a Chief Ethics and Empowerment Officer who reports directly to the board. Their role? To ensure that every voice is heard, every worker is valued, and every decision considers its impact on all employees, not just the bottom line. But perhaps the most remarkable thing, that cleaning cart Maria used for 15 years, it's now in a display case in the company lobby. Below it is a simple plaque that reads, Power isn't about where you sit, it's about where you stand. As for Richard Preston, well, that's another story, because sometimes the biggest falls come not from being pushed down, but from forgetting to look up and see who's really standing tall. Remember those emails that flooded in during the board meeting? They became the foundation for the company's new ethical guidelines. The invisible workforce had become not just visible, but invaluable. And Maria? She still walks the building every evening, not with a cleaning cart now, but with a purpose that inspires others to stand up, speak out, and remember that dignity isn't given by position, it's claimed by action. And that's how a cleaning lady didn't just fire a CEO, she helped clean up corporate America, one invisible voice at a time. End of story? Not quite. Because next week, Maria is testifying before Congress about corporate accountability. But that's a story for another video. If you want to hear what happens next, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from the ground up, one invisible hero at a time. The figure who walked through that boardroom door sent shockwaves through the room. It was Janet Preston, Richard Preston's wife of 30 years and the company's silent majority shareholder. The clicking of her heels against the marble floor echoed like thunder in the sudden silence. Richard, she said, her voice steady but tired, I've spent 3 decades watching you build this company, and 3 decades watching you forget what it was meant to be. Preston's face drained of color. Janet, what are you doing here? This isn't your place? Not my place? Janet's laugh was sharp as glass. Funny you should say that, because I've been thinking a lot about places lately. About where people belong. About who gets to decide that. She turned to Maria and smiled warmly. Ms. Rodriguez, I believe you knew my mother. The room collectively held its breath as Maria nodded slowly. Yes, Mrs. Preston, I used to clean her office when she was still working here. She was the only executive who knew my name, who asked about my children, who encouraged me to pursue my MBA. Janet's eyes glistened. My mother started as a secretary in this company 40 years ago. She worked her way up to become the first female executive, but she never forgot where she came from. When she passed away last year, she left me her shares with very specific instructions. She pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. She told me to wait and watch, to look for someone who understood that a company isn't just its stock price or its profit margins. It's its people, all of its people. Preston's face had turned from white to red. The board won't stand for this, the shareholders. I am the shareholders, Richard, Janet cut in. Or at least 51% of them. My mother spent years quietly buying back shares, preparing for this moment. She knew someday someone would be brave enough to stand up. She just didn't know it would be the same woman who used to share tamales with her during late nights at the office. The room erupted in murmurs as understanding dawned. Eleanor Thompson was smiling now, and Patricia Chen was wiping away tears. But Maria stood perfectly still, remembering those quiet conversations with the elder Mrs. Preston, never realizing she was being watched, being tested, being chosen. Protocol Zero won't help you, Richard, Janet continued, because while you were busy protecting your secrets, you forgot about the oldest form of record-keeping, paper. My mother kept everything. Every memo, every receipt, every whispered confession from employees too scared to speak up. She turned to the gathered crowd outside the boardroom. This company wasn't built by corner offices and executive bonuses. It was built by people who cleaned those offices, who secured those buildings, who maintained those systems. And it's time they had a seat at the table. The next hour was a blur of activity. Federal agents, who had been waiting on Janet's signal, led Preston and his closest allies away, but the real transformation was just beginning. A week later, Griffin and Mitchell International announced its new board structure, one that required representation from every level of the company. The cleaning staff, maintenance workers, and security teams would have as much say in company decisions as the executives. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. Maria Rodriguez didn't just become part of the leadership team. She and Janet Preston together created something revolutionary, the workers' trust. Every employee, from janitors to executives, would now own shares in the company. No one could accumulate more than 5% ownership, ensuring that power would never again concentrate in the hands of a few. The cleaning cart that started it all? It's still there, but not in a display case. It's in active use, passed down to new cleaning staff members as a reminder that dignity isn't about the job you do, it's about how you do it. And Richard Preston, he didn't just lose his company, he lost the narrative he'd built his life around. Because in the end, the true power wasn't in his corner office or his offshore accounts. It was in the hearts and minds of those he never bothered to see. Today, Griffin and Mitchell International is consistently rated one of the best places to work in America. Its profit-sharing program has become a model for corporate reform, and every year, on the anniversary of that fateful board meeting, employees gather to share stories, break bread together, and remember that sometimes the greatest changes come from the most unexpected places. But perhaps the most powerful change, the company's new motto, displayed proudly in every office, everyone's place is at the table. And that, my friends, is how a cleaning lady, a grieving daughter, and an army of invisible workers changed corporate America forever. But wait, there's one more detail you need to know. Remember those tamales Maria used to share? Their recipe is now printed on the back of every employee stock certificate, a reminder that the sweetest success is the one that's shared. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of unexpected heroes changing the world, one brave step at a time. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one sitting at the head of the table, it's the one who knows how to bring everyone to it. 5 years have passed since that unforgettable day in the Griffin and Mitchell International boardroom. The changes that rippled through corporate America weren't just about one company or one moment. They became a movement that transformed how businesses think about their workers, their values, and their true purpose. Let me take you inside Griffin and Mitchell today. The marble floors still shine in the lobby, but now they're maintained by workers who own shares in the company they clean. Tony's daughter? She graduated from business school and now runs the company's innovative security division, implementing programs that protect both assets and people's dignity. Sarah from it was promoted to Chief Technology Officer, where she pioneered a transparent data management system that's become the industry standard for corporate accountability. But the most remarkable transformation happened in the company's culture, those invisible barriers between executives and workers. Gone. The monthly all-hands meetings now take place in a renovated cafeteria where everyone, from board members to maintenance staff, shares meals together. Maria's famous tamales make a regular appearance, and yes, they're still the first thing to disappear from the buffet table. Remember George, the maintenance supervisor? He now leads the company's workforce development program, which provides education and advancement opportunities to employees at all levels. His first initiative, a partnership with local universities offering full scholarships to employees and their children. Last year, they celebrated their 100th graduate. Patricia Chen, who stood up that day in the boardroom, became the company's first chief diversity and inclusion officer. Under her leadership, Griffin and Mitchell has achieved something remarkable, a workforce that truly reflects the communities it serves, with advancement opportunities based on merit rather than connections. As for Janet Preston, she didn't just change one company, she started a revolution. The workers' trust model she and Maria created has been adopted by dozens of major corporations. Business schools now teach it as a case study in sustainable corporate governance. But ask Janet about her proudest achievement, and she'll show you the letter her mother wrote years ago, predicting that someday someone would be brave enough to make real change. Richard Preston. He served his time for financial fraud, but the story doesn't end there. In an unexpected twist, he now gives lectures at business ethics seminars, sharing his journey from power-hungry CEO to humbled advocate for corporate reform. His favorite audience? Cleaning staff and maintenance workers, whom he credits with teaching him his most valuable lesson, that true leadership isn't about position, it's about purpose. The company's quarterly earnings reports now include something unique, a dignity index that measures employee satisfaction, advancement opportunities, and work-life balance. Other companies laughed at first until they noticed something interesting. The higher the dignity index, the better the financial performance. Amanda Preston, who helped expose her father's corruption, didn't step away from corporate law. Instead, she founded a nonprofit organization that provides legal support to whistleblowers and advocates for worker protection laws. Their first major victory, the Invisible Workforce Protection Act, which guarantees representation for service workers on corporate boards. But perhaps the most powerful legacy isn't in the boardroom or the balance sheets. It's in the small moments that happen every day, like when a new cleaning staff member starts their first shift and receives their employee stock certificate, complete with Maria's tamal recipe on the back, or when executives take their turn serving in the cafeteria, wearing aprons and learning the names of every person they serve. The cleaning cart that started it all. It did end up in a display case, but not in the way you might expect. Every month, a different employee, from any level of the company, takes their turn pushing it through the offices after hours. They call it the Dignity Juvie, a reminder that no job is beneath anyone and every role deserves respect. Maria Rodriguez still works at Griffin and Mitchell, but not as the Chief Ethics and Empowerment Officer everyone expected. Instead, she created something different, the Company Culture Council, a rotating group of employees from every department to shape policy together. Her office? It's wherever she's needed, but you can often find her in the break room, sharing coffee and stories with the night shift workers. The company's stock price? It's higher than ever, but that's not what they celebrate at their annual meetings. Instead, they measure success by how many employees' children graduated college, how many families bought their first homes, how many dreams became reality because dignity and opportunity were finally shared equally. Last month, a young intern found something interesting in the company archives, an old security camera footage from that fateful day 5 years ago. As they watched Preston being led away in handcuffs, someone asked Maria if she felt vindicated. Her response became the company's new unofficial motto. Victory isn't about watching someone fall, it's about helping everyone rise. And rise they did. Today, Griffin and Mitchell International isn't just a company. It's a blueprint for what business can be when every voice matters, every role has dignity, and every person has a seat at the table. So the next time someone tells you that one person can't change the system, remember the cleaning lady who saw what others missed, the wife who honored her mother's wisdom, and the invisible workforce that became unstoppable when they stood together. Because sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from fancy strategies or corporate retreats. They come from simple truths, that dignity matters more than titles, that courage wears many uniforms, and that the most important cleaning up happens not on floors or windows, but in the hearts and minds of those who forgot what really matters. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of transformation. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. But more importantly, look around your own workplace. Who are the invisible heroes in your life? What changes could you help make happen? Because remember, sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one making the most noise. Sometimes it's the one quietly pushing their cart, watching, waiting, and believing that dignity is worth fighting for. This is your host signing off, but the story? Well, it's still being written, one brave voice at a time.